February 14th, 1884. Frost coated the windows of Robert Sterling's ranch house, thick as candle wax, and the wind came howling across the Wyoming flats with the kind of cold that settles into your teeth and stays there. The snow stretched out in every direction, white and endless, and the sky above it was the pale gray of something that had forgotten how to feel. Now, you have to understand something about Robert Sterling's house. 14 rooms, 3 fireplaces, pantries stocked deep enough to feed a small army clear through spring, crystal lamps and oak banisters, and a piano nobody played anymore. A house built for a family that no longer existed. Robert stood at the kitchen window, coffee going cold in his hand, watching first light crawl across the snow. Behind him, his children came down for breakfast, quiet as church mice. Edward, 8 years old, with his mother's serious eyes and his father's habit of keeping his thoughts locked behind them. Catherine, 6, still clutching the rag doll Eleanor had stitched 2 weeks before the consumption took her. They ate their oatmeal without fuss, said yes, sir, and no, sir. And Robert realized, with an ache that lived somewhere behind his ribs, that his children had learned politeness in the exact place where laughter should have been. He passed the east wing hallway on his way to the barn. The door was locked, same as it had been for 2 years. The key hung on a nail beside it, tarnished from disuse. Robert kept his eyes forward, same as every morning. Outside, the cold hit like a slap from God. His foreman, Hank, was already in the horse barn, forking hay with the grim efficiency of a man who knew complaining wouldn't warm him up. "Mornin', boss. Cold enough to freeze the horns off a steer." "That it is." Robert was checking the water troughs, cracking ice with a hammer. When Hank appeared in the barn door, his face had changed. "Boss, you ought to come look at this." And Robert followed Hank's finger toward the north road. 5 shapes moved against the white, slow and wrong. A woman carrying something bundled against her chest. 3 small figures clinging to her skirts like if they let go, the wind would take them. Even from 200 yards. Robert could see it the way the woman tilted sideways with each step, the way the smallest child kept dropping to its knees and being pulled back up by a hand that was running out of strength. Then the woman fell. Not a stumble, a collapse. She went down like a cut fence post, and the children crumpled around her in the snow. Robert was running before he knew he'd decided to move. The snow grabbed at his boots, tried to hold him, but he drove through it, the way a man drives through anything when something deep in his chest says now or never. He reached them breathless. The woman's face was gray as the sky above her. Her lips cracked, her eyes barely open. She looked up at him without hope or fear, just the flat, scraped-out exhaustion of someone who had used every last thing she had. "My children," she whispered. "Please." Robert knelt and lifted the smallest from the snow. A girl, maybe 3. She weighed almost nothing. Through the thin blanket, he could count every rib with his fingers. "Hank!" he shouted into the wind. "Bring the wagon! Right now!" Anna Cooper came back to the world in pieces. First warmth, not the memory of warmth she'd been chasing for weeks, but real heat pressing against her skin from a fire close enough to hear. Then to weight. Blankets heavier than anything she'd touched since James was alive, since Missouri, since the life before this one. Then sounds a child whimpering, a man's voice low and steady, a spoon against a bowl. Her children. Anna's eyes flew open. They were all there, all four, scattered across beds and sofas, in a room larger than the cabin she'd shared with James for 6 years. Thomas, 9, asleep with his arm draped over Margaret. 7. William, 5, curled in a quilt by the hearth, and baby Sarah. Anna's heart seized. Sarah was cradled in the arms of a man she had never seen, and he was spooning broth into her daughter's mouth with a patience that made no sense coming from a stranger. He tilted the spoon gently, waited for Sarah to swallow, and wiped her chin with a cloth that was cleaner than anything Anna had owned in months. The man looked up. Dark hair, a jaw that looked carved from the same wood as his furniture, lines around his eyes that came from squinting into distance, not from smiling. His clothes were plain, but the fabric was fine. The room behind him gleamed with polished wood and brass. Wealthy. Anna's stomach knotted, and it had nothing to do with hunger. It was the cold arithmetic of debt every blanket, every bowl of broth, every log on that fire adding up to a number she could never repay. She tried to sit, and the room tilted. "Easy now, ma'am." His voice was steady, not soft. Steady. "Doc Harmon's been and gone. Says your young ones need rest and steady meals. You need the same, plus time for that lung fever to clear." Pneumonia. She could feel it, the wet rattle deep in her chest, the fever circling like a wolf at the edge of a campfire. She'd been ignoring it for days. Stopping meant dying. Walking meant maybe dying slower. "Where?" Her voice came out like tearing paper. "My ranch. Sterling Ranch. 8 miles south of Clearwater. I'm Robert Sterling." He set the broth down and lifted Sarah onto his shoulder to burp her, gentle as any father. "Your children are safe. Mrs. Cooper. Anna Cooper." The facts of her life surfaced through the fever haze. James, dead of fever 5 months ago in Missouri. Savings gone to the doctor who couldn't save him. The farm sold for debts. Heading west because a cousin in Oregon might take them in. Money gone in Nebraska. Food gone 3 days ago. She'd been walking since dawn yesterday, carrying Sarah, pulling the others forward on nothing but will and terror. "Mr. Sterling!" Anna's cracked voice found its edge. "I need to know what this costs." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were not unkind, but they weren't pitying either. That was something. "Rest, ma'am. Your children are safe." Anna closed her eyes, but she did not rest. Behind her lids, she was already calculating what she owed this man, and how many years of her life it would take to pay it back. Safe was not the same as free. The doctor's report came back better than Robert had any right to hope. The children were malnourished, but young enough to bounce back. Steady meals, warm beds, a week of rest, and they'd be right again. Anna was worse. The pneumonia had dug in deep, and Harmon said 2 weeks minimum before she could be on her feet proper. What struck Robert wasn't the hunger, it was what the hunger had failed to touch. Thomas held doors. Margaret said, "Thank you, sir," every time someone handed her a plate. William sat still through the doctor's examination without a single complaint, though his lip trembled. Even little Sarah waited her turn, watching the others with dark, patient eyes. Manners like that didn't come from nowhere. They came from a mother who'd held the line even while everything around her was falling apart. That evening, Robert stood in the hallway outside the East Wing with the key in his hand. He needed the rooms. 4 children and a sick woman needed space, and the guest parlor wasn't enough. He fit the key into the lock. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. The mechanism turned with a sound like a small bone snapping. He pushed the door open. The air that came out was stale and cold and carried the faint ghost of Eleanor's lavender soap. 2 years faded, but not gone. Dust lay on every surface like a gray skin. Her rocking chair sat by the window with a half-finished quilt still draped across the arm. The needle still threaded, as if she'd only stepped out for a moment and would be back directly. Robert gripped the doorframe. His knuckles went white. He breathed through his nose. Slow, until the tightness in his chest loosened enough to move. He opened the curtains. Late light fell across the floorboards and caught the dust motes drifting through the air like tiny lost things finding their way. Edward and Catherine appeared behind him, drawn by the unfamiliar glow. Catherine pressed against the doorframe, clutching her rag doll. Edward studied his father's face with the careful attention of a boy who had learned to read grief the way other boys read trail signs. "We're making up these rooms," Robert said. His voice came out rough. "For Mrs. Cooper and her young ones." Catherine's eyes moved to the rocking chair. "Mama's rooms. Rooms that need using. Sweetheart, that's all." He carried fresh linens in himself, made the beds, set a lamp where Anna could reach it from the pillow. When he lifted sleeping Sarah from the parlor sofa and carried her to the small bed in the nursery, the child curled against his chest and released a sigh so deep, so trusting, that Robert had to stand very still in the dark room for a moment before he could set her down. Later that night, after the house had settled, he heard it. Laughter. Faint. Sleepy. Drifting from the East Wing. Margaret whispering something to Catherine. A giggle. Then quiet. Robert stood in the hallway with his hand pressed flat against the wall. Children's laughter in rooms that had known nothing but silence and dust for 2 years. He didn't know if his heart was breaking open or mending sabiang shut. Maybe there wasn't a difference. By the 3rd day, Anna could sit up. By the 5th, she could walk to the kitchen and back without the walls tilting. And by the 5th day, her pride had outrun her lungs. She watched Robert's household from every doorway she passed through. Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, ran things with brisk precision hot meals on time. Floors swept. Children scrubbed. But when Anna complimented the bread one morning, Mrs. Dalton just shrugged and said, "It's bread. Mrs. Cooper, ain't nobody here to notice if it's good or not." A house full of people and nobody noticing. Anna filed that away. Robert's children were tended the way expensive horses were tended, fed on schedule. Groomed, kept safe. But nobody sat with Edward when he read. Nobody braided Catherine's hair. The machinery of care without the warmth of it. Anna said nothing. It wasn't her place. None of this was her place. When Mrs. Dalton brought a new dress to Anna's room, dove gray, good wool, store-bought, Anna folded it carefully and held it out. "I'm much obliged, Mrs. Dalton, but I can't accept this. Mr. Sterling said I won't accept charity." Anna's voice was quiet, but it had iron underneath. I've got needle and thread. I can mend what I have." Word traveled fast. Robert appeared in her doorway within the hour, hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way men do when they've walked into a conversation they don't know how to have. "Mrs. Cooper, it's just a dress. Yours are—" He stopped himself, wisely, before he finished that sentence. "Worn. I know." Anna met his eyes. "I won't be beholden for what I don't need. Mr. Sterling." He studied her face. Then he nodded. Slow. "Fair enough, ma'am." He left. Anna shut her bedroom door firmly, deliberately, and pressed her back against the wood. Her hands were trembling, and she didn't know if it was the fever still burning low or something else entirely. Pride. Maybe. Or the fear of what happens when pride starts to crack. That evening, she heard his voice from the parlor. She opened her door 1 inch. Just enough. Robert sat on the floor with all 6 children around him, reading frontier tales by lamplight. Thomas leaned against the sofa, pretending he was too old to care, but his eyes never left the page. Margaret sat cross-legged at Robert's knee. William had crawled into Robert's lap without being invited, and Robert had shifted to make room without breaking stride in the story. His arms settled around the boy as naturally as breathing. Edward and Catherine flanked him on either side, leaned in close, filling a space that had been empty for 2 years. Anna gripped the doorframe until her knuckles whitened. She pulled the door shut softly, but the crack in her chest had widened, and no amount of pride was going to close it now. Here is something you ought to know about hunger. It doesn't just empty a body. It strips away everything that makes a person who they are, the quickness, the backbone, the light behind the eyes. And when food comes back, when strength returns, you don't just watch a person recover. You see them emerge, like a photograph developing in solution, the real image rising to the surface for the first time. By the end of the first week, Robert Sterling saw who Anna Cooper truly was. She reorganized his kitchen in 2 days, not by asking permission, by simply doing it while Mrs. Dalton stood in the doorway with her mouth open. The pantry rearranged by season and use. A weekly menu pinned to the wall that somehow cost less flour and produced better meals. Then she found the ranch books. Robert walked into his study on a Tuesday morning and found Anna at his desk. She'd put on spectacles, small wire-rimmed things she'd been hiding in her carpet bag, as if needing them was something to be ashamed of. Her finger moved down the columns of figures, stopped, circled an entry in ink without a moment's hesitation. "Your bookkeeper's been overcharging you on feed grain," she said, not looking up. 12 cents per bushel above the Clearwater rate. Over a year, that's nearly $40 walking out your door. Robert stared at the circled number, at the spectacles, at the ink-stained confidence of a woman who had been half dead in his snow 10 days ago. "I kept my husband's books for 6 years. Mr. Sterling, I can read a ledger the way you read a brand." That night, Robert sat at his desk with a sheet of paper and tried to write an offer. He wrote, "I'd like to help you," and crossed it out. He wrote, "I want you to stay," and stared at it until the ink dried. Then crumpled the paper and threw it in the fire. He tried again. "I need someone organized." That was closer. That was something a proud woman could accept without feeling purchased. He found her the next afternoon in the kitchen, sleeves rolled past her elbows, teaching Catherine to knead bread. Catherine's small hands worked the dough in clumsy imitation of Anna's steady rhythm. and both of them were smiling. "Mrs. Cooper, I have a proposition." Robert kept his voice level, the way he kept it when negotiating cattle prices. "I need someone organized to manage this household and these books. You need employment. I'm offering a position, salary, room and board for you and your children." He paused. "It's business." Anna wiped her hands on her apron. She studied his face the way she'd studied his ledger, searching for hidden figures. For the entry that didn't add up. For the catch. She found none. Robert had spent 2 nights learning to dress respect in the plain clothes of pragmatism. "Business," she repeated. "Straight business. Then I accept, Mr. Sterling, on one condition. I earn my keep, every cent." They shook hands. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused, and Robert held on perhaps a moment longer than any business arrangement required. That night he sat at his ledger and noticed he'd written Anna in the margin. He stared at it for a long time. He did not cross it out. And down the hall, Anna's bedroom door stood open. Just an inch. But an inch, he was learning, was everything. Children don't build walls the way grown folks do. They don't set conditions, or keep ledgers, or measure every kindness against some invisible debt. Children just love. The way water runs downhill, because it's the only direction that makes sense. The 6 of them became a single tribe inside a week. The afternoon Robert saw it happen clearly was a Thursday. Thomas and Edward had spent the morning tracking rabbit prints through the crusted snow behind the barn. They came back mud-caked to the elbows, and Thomas was explaining to Edward with the grave authority of a 9-year-old expert that the rabbit had doubled back on its own trail to confuse predators. Edward listened with wide, serious eyes, then pointed to a second set of prints neither of them had noticed. They crouched together in the mud, heads almost touching, debating whether it was a fox or a coyote. And Robert realized he was watching his son have a conversation longer than any he'd had in 2 years. Margaret and Catherine became inseparable. They shared Eleanor's rag doll between them with the solemnity of a peace treaty, braiding each other's hair by the fire each evening. William, 5 years old and burning with questions, attached himself to Robert's shadow. "How come horses sleep standing up?" "Sir." "How old is that mountain?" "Can I ride the brown one tomorrow?" Robert taught them all to ride. His too and hers. No distinction between them. He knelt in the mud to adjust stirrups, ruining his good shirt without noticing or caring. He read to all 6 every evening and answered every question, no matter how small, as if it mattered. Anna watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as Robert carried Catherine on his shoulders across the yard, William trotting alongside, gripping Robert's coat. She reached for the counter to steady herself, and her hand pressed flat against the wood, and she stood there, breathing carefully until the feeling passed. It didn't pass. She walked through the east wing that evening and stopped before Eleanor's portrait. A gentle face, kind eyes. Anna understood, standing before that painting. The weight of what Robert had locked away, and the courage it had taken to open these rooms for strangers. She touched the frame once, lightly, the way you'd touch something sacred. Then came the moment that changed everything, small enough to fit in a 3-year-old's hands. Baby Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway. Robert was passing through, ledger under his arm, mind on cattle prices. Sarah raised both arms and said one word, "Up." Robert stopped. He set the ledger on the hall table. He lifted her. Sarah tucked her head beneath his chin and curled one small fist into his collar, and her eyes closed with the absolute trust of a child who has decided, without negotiation or doubt, that this person is safe. Robert's hand came up and cupped the back of her head. His jaw tightened. He blinked hard, twice, and didn't move. Across the room, Anna watched. Her hand found the doorframe again. This time she didn't look away. She couldn't. That night, all 6 children fell asleep in a pile on the parlor rug, tangled together like a litter of pups who'd never known separate beds. Robert and Anna stood on opposite sides of the room, looking down at them. Then, without meaning to, at each other. The lamplight caught Anna's face, and Robert saw something there he hadn't seen before, or maybe something she'd stopped hiding. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Anna heard them at the general store. She'd walked into Clearwater for thread and salt, her first trip to town since the rescue. She wore her mended dress with her chin level and her back straight. Mrs. Dalton had offered the wagon, but Anna walked. She needed to feel like a woman who went places under her own power, not one who was delivered. She was reaching for a spool of white thread when the voices floated from the next aisle, clear and deliberate in the way gossip always is when it wants to be overheard. A widow not 6 months and already living under his roof. I'd like to see her explain that to the Ladies' Aid. Sterling's charity case. Though I wonder what kind of charity keeps a woman in a man's house with the door open all night. 4 children and no husband. You'd think she'd have the decency to board at the hotel instead of ruin a good man's reputation. Anna's hand froze on the thread. The color drained from her face so completely that the shopkeeper leaned forward across the counter and asked if she needed water. She shook her head. She bought nothing. She walked home in the cold, and every step drove those words deeper like fence nails into green wood. Robert found her in the East Wing, packing. "What are you doing? Leaving, Mr. Sterling." Her voice was controlled, but her hands betrayed her. They shook as she folded William's shirt, pressing the creases sharp, smoothing the fabric with the desperate precision of a woman holding herself together by holding everything else in order. "I won't have my children raised under whispers. I've lost nearly everything. I will not lose my good name. Anna, Mrs. Cooper." The wall went up, brick by brick, in 2 words. Robert stood in that doorway and felt the ground shift under him. He'd spent 2 weeks believing money could solve things, pay the doctor, stock the pantry, heat the rooms, buy the time. But money could not answer gossip. Money could not quiet the Clearwater Ladies' Aid. Money could not do one blessed thing about a proud woman's reputation. And every offer he could make higher salary, better rooms, new dresses would only prove those voices right. He could not purchase Anna Cooper's dignity. He could not buy her a reason to stay. So he did the only thing money had never been any use for. He told the truth. He walked past her to the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He pushed the ledger aside, the armor he'd worn for 2 years, the columns and figures he'd hidden behind, while his children grew up polite and lonely. He folded his hands. When Anna came through carrying another armload of William's clothes, Robert spoke quietly. "I ain't much for speeches. Anna, never have been." He kept his eyes on his hands. "But I need to say this plain. I'm not rescuing you. You're rescuing me." He paused. "This house has been a tomb for 2 years. I've walked through it like a dead man counting his rooms. Your children brought it back to life. You brought it back to life. And if you leave, it goes dark again, and I don't reckon I can bear it." Anna stood in the kitchen doorway holding William's Sunday shirt. The lamplight caught the dampness in her eyes. She didn't answer. Not with words. She turned back to the east wing. Robert sat at the table and listened. Footsteps. A closet door opening. The soft thud of the carpetbag being set down on the shelf. The small, definitive click of the latch closing. Then Anna came back through the kitchen. She stopped at the stove, put the kettle on, and set out 2 cups. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Here is what Anna Cooper never told a living soul. Not that night, and not for many years after. She had already been dreaming of staying long before the gossip ever reached her. March 14th, 1884. The light had changed. It was still cold, still February's territory. But the edges had softened the brutal white, giving way to something almost gold. As if the sun had remembered it was allowed to be warm. Robert came in from the barn at 4:30 and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Flour. Everywhere. On the table, the chairs, the floor, the dog, and all 6 children. Margaret stood on a stool, showing Catherine how to braid a loaf, their 4 hands working the dough together. Thomas measured ingredients with the grave precision he brought to tracking rabbits in the snow. William had flour in his eyebrows and both ears, and was grinning like it was Christmas morning. Baby Sarah sat on the counter, patting a lump of dough with open palms, laughing every time it made a sound, and in the center of it all stood Anna. Flour dusted across her cheek, hair escaping its pins. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hands working steadily, her voice guiding 6 children through the ancient mystery of bread. She was not beautiful the way paintings are beautiful. She was beautiful the way a lit window is beautiful when you've been riding in the dark for a long time, and you'd started to believe there were no more lit windows left in the world. A tug on his sleeve. Edward, his quiet, careful boy, looking up at him with Eleanor's eyes. "Pa," Catherine appeared at his other elbow. She took Robert's hand and held it something she had not done in months. She pressed close against his leg, flour handprints on his trousers, and looked up with the frank directness that belongs exclusively to 6-year-old children who have not yet learned that some questions are supposed to be difficult. "Papa, can Miss Anna and her kids stay forever?" The kitchen went silent. Margaret's hand stopped mid-braid. Thomas studied the flour on the table with sudden intensity. William looked from face to face, reading the room with the instinct of a 5-year-old who'd learned to sense weather changes in grown-ups. Anna's hands stilled in the dough. Her eyes found Robert's across the room. 6 children, 4 of hers, 2 of his, all of them dusted in flour and waiting for an answer to a question that was simpler than any adult would ever know how to ask. Robert's hand tightened on Catherine's. He put his other hand on Edward's shoulder. "We'll talk about that, sweetheart," he said softly. "I promise you." Evening came slow that night. The children were bathed and storied and argued into bed, and finally, mercifully, asleep. The house settled around them with the particular quiet of a place that has been full of noise and is resting from it. Robert found Anna on the front porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the eaves. Water dripped from the icicles in slow, steady drops. The first thaw. Winter letting go, one drop at a time, reluctant, but unable to hold. He stood beside her. The silence between them had changed across the weeks from the stiff silence of strangers to the loaded silence of people who have too much to say and not enough courage to begin. Now it had become something else, a comfortable silence, a silence that didn't need filling. The thaw dripped. A coyote called from the dark hills. Inside the house, a child murmured and turned over in sleep. Anna, not Mrs. Cooper. He'd earned the right, or she'd given it. He wasn't sure which. She looked at him. Lamplight from the open door caught her face. I ain't much for pretty words, and I've been studying on this for longer than I probably should admit. He took a breath. I'm offering partnership, not rescue. Marry me. Manage this ranch together. Raise all our children as one family. The thaw kept dripping. The coyote had gone quiet. The whole territory seemed to lean in and listen. Anna's voice came clear and steady. As equals, as equals. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, the same grip she'd used the day they shook on business. But this time her thumb traced a slow line across his knuckle. And this time, neither of them let go. Behind them, the front door stood wide open. Light poured out across the porch boards and spilled into the dark, reaching further than it had any right to reach. They married that Sunday in the parlor. 6 children stood witness, scrubbed and solemn in their best clothes. Old Reverend Hale read the vows with the unhurried gravity of a man who believed every word. Anna wore her mended dress because she had earned every stitch in it, and Robert wore his work shirt because that was who he was when the ledgers were closed and the truth was showing. Mrs. Dalton cried into her apron and pretended she wasn't. Hank shook Robert's hand so hard his shoulder popped, then bent down and shook each child's hand too. All 6 of them, one by one. The blended family of 6 sat down to supper that night at a table built for 2. It wasn't big enough. That was the whole point. They crowded in, elbows knocking, passing biscuits over each other's heads, and the sound that filled that kitchen laughter and chatter, and William's milk tipping sideways across the cloth, was the sound Robert had been missing for 2 years without knowing its name. Now, I wish I could tell you the years after that were all smooth riding and clear skies. But this is the frontier, and the frontier has never made that promise. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken fences, arguments that rattled the windows, and long silences that needed mending the way a good fence needs mending with patience, and honest hands, and the will to show up again the next morning. But Robert and Anna met every one of those seasons the way they'd started, as partners, as equals, 2 people who had found each other in the snow and chose, every single day, to keep choosing. The years turned, steady as the seasons that carried them. Thomas grew up to be a doctor, the kind who rode out in weather that kept other men by their fires. He treated folks whether they could pay or not, and when anyone asked why, he said he'd learned it from a man who once carried a stranger's child through a blizzard without stopping to ask her name. Margaret became a schoolteacher. She was the one who stayed late for the slow readers, who kept extra biscuits in her desk drawer for the children who came to school hungry, because she remembered in her hands, in her bones, what it felt like to need something you couldn't ask for. Edward took over the ranch with a quiet competence that Robert recognized as Eleanor's gift. Passed forward. Catherine and William, inseparable since the day flour covered every surface of the Sterling kitchen, opened a mercantile together in Clearwater. Above the door, they hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Fair prices, open door," and Sarah, little Sarah, who had once lifted her arms to a stranger and spoken the word that unlocked everything. She grew into a woman who opened her own home to travelers every winter. She fed them. She warmed them. She asked nothing in return except that they sit down, rest, and let someone take care of them for a while. The East Wing was never locked again. Eleanor's portrait hung in the family hallway, where the children passed it every day honored, visible, part of the story instead of sealed away from it. On a spring evening decades later, warm enough to leave the windows open, Robert and Anna sat on the same front porch where he'd proposed. Their hair had gone to silver. Their hands, folded together on the armrest between their rocking chairs, were weathered and lined with years. Behind them, grandchildren chased each other through the house, their laughter filling rooms that hadn't known silence in 30 years. Robert watched Anna's face in the last light. She sat the way she always sat, straight-backed, steady-eyed, with the quiet strength of a woman who had walked through the worst winter of her life and come out the other side with her dignity in both hands. "I reckon that was the best deal I ever made," he said. Anna smiled, the same smile he'd first seen over a kitchen table covered in flour. "I reckon it was the best partnership I ever accepted." The door behind them stood open. It had stood open for 30 years. Light spilled from the house across the porch and out into the gathering dusk, reaching toward the north road where, on a February morning that felt like a lifetime ago, 5 figures had stumbled through the snow toward something they couldn't see, but somehow trusted was there. Robert learned that money's greatest purpose is not what it buys. It's who it lifts, not from above, but alongside. And Anna discovered that accepting help is not weakness, not when it's offered with respect, not when it builds something neither person could have built alone. Between them, across the years and the seasons and the wide open door of that house, they proved what folks out here have always known. The best families are not born, they are built. One open door at a time.